A puzzling book in the Bible, known as the Song of Songs. Song of Songs merely means the greatest song, or it could mean a set of songs. And it is a set of erotic love poems. But we may ask, what is the place for such a book in the Bible? The Song of Songs. Now let's just draw together some evidence about this book. At the beginning there is a title, Song of the Songs to Solomon. Now it couldn't have been written by Solomon because it contradicts his behavior. Almost certainly it's a picture of the true meaning of sexual love, and implicitly it's being compared to the kind of behavior that Solomon demonstrated when he took so many foreign women as his wives, multiple wives and concubines, undermined the whole structure of his kingdom, which split in two immediately on his death. It could be a tribute to Solomon's great wisdom, but that wisdom went totally astray when it came to human relationships. So it's a contrast there too. If we look at it, it's a set of songs. They cannot be set in an historical context. They apply anywhere at any time. And there is no storyline in the songs, and an attempt to impose one produces all kinds of distortions. We've got to remember they're a set of songs which is written in poetry, and we've got to interpret them that way. We've got to look at the language, and people have done this. Much of the language is metaphorical. That's the way of poetry. Much is highly sensual, and to try and ignore that undermines the nature of the language of the book, and in many cases the language is often highly erotic. In the same way as in modern languages today, we refer to the intimate parts of men and women using all sorts of roundabout language. The poetry here does exactly the same. But now we have a fair idea of what these words mean and how they would have been understood by the original hearers. Now in this set of songs, there is a woman, there is a man, and there's a kind of commentary or people listening in a wider society. But the woman is dominant. What she is saying and the expression of her views and feelings takes up the bulk of the book. And we end up with a picture of her as a young woman who is virtuous, assertive and positive. And we've got to remember that has to be seen against a culture and a society where that was not the normal way for women to be seen. They were submissive, subservient in these male-dominated societies. But here's a woman who's dominant, assertive, with a positive perspective. Now that would bring a fresh light in the whole relationship in marriage and sexual relationship. Some more evidence. If we look back in history, right from the very beginning, it's in the Old Testament, from the earliest records, and it's always been valued highly. And indeed there are large numbers of very early commentaries about the book. So historically, the people who interpreted it rejected its overtly sexual nature. They said it couldn't be that. That's an opinion. So they interpreted it allegorically. But the problem with that is that the interpretations go all over the place, and some of them are highly speculative. And that's a feature of these early commentaries. There's great dangers here. We can make the book mean almost anything we want it to mean if we interpret it that way. Now let's look at the word allegory. That has been the traditional way that people have looked at this book, the Song of Songs. Now there's two ways of looking at an allegory. You can look at a book or a poem or a piece of writing and call it an allegory because it's obvious that the writer intended it to be that way. The writer obviously intended a story or an event or a poem or whatever to carry a meaning under the surface. And you can see it very clearly. And when you look at this book, that is simply not true. There is no evidence in the book at all from either the writer or the writers of the separate poems which may have been collated. There's no evidence whatsoever that is meant to be interpreted allegorically. No clues, no pointers. You can look at an allegory in the sense that the reader comes to the text with a strategy to interpret the text. The reader has already decided what the strategy is, already decided what the substance of the meaning is, and he or she finds that meaning under the surface. Now there's a terrible danger with that, because that's what's happened much of the history of the book, and people have come up with whatever they wanted the book to mean. They've ignored the language, ignored the context, ignored the culture, ignored how it would have been understood by the original hearers, and they've imposed a meaning onto the book. Now all of this came about because of the influence of Greek philosophy, and I don't think it's very sensible that we interpret our Bibles on the basis of Greek philosophy that stems back to the great Plato. Now this goes back long before the days of Jesus, and an idea started to grow in Greek philosophy that the spirit and the soul of human beings were good, but the body wasn't good. It was their way of interpreting the mess of society of that time and of every time. Now that philosophy has continued on and has influenced the whole of Western mindsets and thinking for centuries. It's not biblical, because it implies that God made bits of human beings good and bits of us not good. Now the logical following on from that was that sex, as something the body did, wasn't good. It was, if you like, a necessary evil. It satisfied male lusts and it gave women children. But in itself it wasn't a good thing. We find that a strange way of thinking today, but that was a very common way. And in some ways it was a revolt against the abuse and the exploitation of sex in the cultures of the Greek and Roman days and thereafter, where people with power exploited others ruthlessly through sex. Now the deduction from that was that the Song of Songs couldn't be sexual in nature, because sex wasn't really a good thing. It was a necessary evil. Now that led in due time to people opting out of relationship, marriage and sex. And so you had the beginning of monasticism. People were drawing away, suppressing their natural body needs and desires, and celibacy was being advocated as something that was good, and all sorts of justifications are put up for it. And then in due time, celibacy was demanded for those who wanted to go through a spiritual life in the priesthood. And it all goes back to Greek philosophy. Now, one of the sad things is that the church today rarely engages with teaching on issues related to sexuality. That's the downstream pattern that's come from this way of thinking. Yes, some churches lay down rules that to be a priest you must be celibate. Some churches lay down rules, for example, contraception is wrong. Sex before marriage is wrong. But we're not really engaging with what the Bible says and its implications. We're not really engaging with the implications of that in a society today which is built on sexuality up high. We've got to learn lessons, and this book is something to teach us because it brings sexuality right to the center of the picture. Now, there was a big change in thinking that took place about the middle of the 19th century. The allegorical view of the Song of Songs started to disappear, and it's largely gone today. Not completely. You can still see that allegorical view in some of the more biblicist approaches to the Bible. People who take it literalistically, ripping verses and things out of context and imposing the meaning they want on them. But by and large, the vast majority of people looking at this book have rejected the allegorical view, and for very good reasons. And what has replaced it is an explicit sexual view. This is a book about the place of the sexual relationship between two human beings and its importance, its power, and its dangers. Now, this has arisen for very good reasons. The old Platonic philosophy, going back to Plato himself, has lost its power in modern day society. We don't have this separation of my spirit, myself, we're good, but my body is all bad and evil. We don't hold these views today. But over the centuries, people have gathered literary evidence and found that there are vast numbers of poems, written in the cultures about that time round about, where many of the features that we see in the Song of Songs can also be seen, and that the poems in the other cultures are always sexual. We've also gathered a lot of historical evidence to show a lot about marriage practices and things related to the male-female relationship in the cultures of the time. And then we look at the logical evidence. There's nothing in the book that suggests an allegory. The language evidence contradicts it. And at the same time, the power of tradition has been weakened. People nowadays are encouraged to think for themselves and to question, and not to believe things because some authority figure says that they are true. So there's been a complete change of thinking. The problem with the allegorical view, and this is very simple, oversimplified perhaps, it made two basic mistakes. It just ignored the actual book and what the book actually said. And it imposed arbitrary interpretations to suit theological preconceptions. You can come to any book, biblical or otherwise, and if you've already made up your mind about a number of things, you can find that book supporting your preconceptions by carefully selecting. And this pick and mix theology, where people take verses out of context and build all sorts of theologies on them, that's a real danger that's come with this book. You come to any biblical text by just looking at the text. What does it say? What do the words mean? And then you look at the words and say, how would the original hearers have understood them? The book was said, spoken, and then recorded for the people at about the time of Solomon, before or after. How would they have understood it? You don't read the text with a kind of Western mindset, 21st century, literalistically backwards, ripping little sentences out here and there and imposing meanings on them to suit ourselves. That's no way to treat any book. Sadly, it's still being done with the Bible. Now, I think in our society, in any society, that would be accepted. The most intimate and powerful of relationships. It's part of the way that God made us. This book addresses it. The great theologian Tremper Longman III said that about this book. Sexuality is a major aspect of the human experience, and God in His wisdom has spoken through the poet or poets of the song to encourage us as well as warn us about its power in our lives. There's a balance in this book. Wise words. And in the church today, particularly in the West, we have got to come to terms with the whole issues of sexuality because we have not come up front with it and not really engaged with the issues. We've been very ill-equipped to deal with the sexual revolution which has happened in the last 50 years or so. It's a collation of love poems. When you look at it, that's very obvious. Yes, there are characters, a woman, a man, and a wider crowd. But you can't identify these people with anyone specific. They are poetic characters. And what the song is doing is that. True sexual love is an integral part of being a human. Yes, there are humans who choose not to be involved. That's fine. But for most human beings, then and today, true sexual love is an integral part of being human. And this book engages with the issues using down-to-earth, earthy language. It's blunt, sometimes erotic. It's realistic. And it engages with the issue, with the power and strength of that relationship, as well as with its dangers. I'm indebted to Tremper Longman III for saying that insight, giving that insight. The wisdom literature of the Old Testament, of which Song of Songs is one, and books like Ecclesiastes and Proverbs or others, wisdom is the application of God's will to the nitty-gritty of life. This certainly is the nitty-gritty of life. And this book describes a love, often from the woman's perspective. It's intense, exclusive, and faithful in spite of obstacles. And in some ways it expands the ideas that we see in Proverbs, the way of a man with a maiden. This strong relationship, powerful, emotional, but also with dangers. Now, in our modern day society, we tend to treat sex as a kind of idol, a be-all and end-all. And in some ways it's seen as almost giving the ultimate meaning and purpose of life, particularly for young people. And many get hurt because of its abuse. Anything that's an idol is anything that we allow into our lives that becomes a kind of replacement for God. The tragedy is this: we're not really engaging with the issue. We haven't done it for centuries. For centuries we thought, well, it's a kind of necessary evil. We elevated priests as a kind of superior spiritual beings. Celibacy was elevated. Expression of ultimate devotion. And it was necessary for the generation of children. But we haven't engaged with it. Yes, we've sometimes suppressed it, but it's rarely been taught or explored in an open and positive way. Now that has generated a most unfortunate polarization. And that polarization has left the church unable to cope with the major issues of today. Now, this is where the Song of Songs comes in. It can help us to break that polarization. We've got to recognize that simple fact. And because it's so important, it's easily abused. Sex is not a god. It doesn't solve everything. That's fairy tale land. But that's also true. We're not perfect. And we mess up this wonderful relationship and physical expression. But Song of Songs pictures it this way. Mutuality. Now that is quite revolutionary in the culture and context of his day, where women were seen as possessions to give men pleasure, and women saw their role in generating children. And that view is still existing in many societies and cultures throughout the world today. Sexual love is mutual, but exclusive, total and beautiful. And that cuts right across the old Platonic view that sex is an unfortunate evil that we've got to put up with. We go back to the 19th century. The tragedies out of that time, because the church had so often failed to engage with the issues, the knowledge related to sex was very low. It was never taught in schools, and it was just pushed under the carpet within the church. We have never changed over the centuries. And as a result, girls became pregnant through ignorance. Girls who became pregnant were often treated atrociously within the church. But the young bride who was entering marriage entered marriage totally unprepared for what was about to hit her. She was in love with her husband. But what happened their first night together? She often would just freeze because she was not prepared. She did not understand. She had never been taught. And there was a conflict within her between the love of her husband and the way he wanted to express that love with her. But in recent times, the advent of the pill about 1960, it allowed societies to detach sex from pregnancy. Meanwhile, we continued on, not engaging with the subject. Now, while there were some exceptions, that still is a broad pattern of truth when we look back historically, sadly. So that allowed sex to become a selfish satisfaction. There were no consequences for sleeping around. But there are. And we're seeing these today. And it's growing. Many of the problems of modern day society relating to sexual issues, we the people of God have got responsibilities that in the past, because we didn't engage with the issues openly and honestly, we're ill prepared to deal with them today. But we've also left our societies in a mess. We can stand at the edge and criticize. We should be looking in at ourselves and saying, where did we go wrong? The love poems of the song, then, they're positive. And we need to state that today. But intense emotion may be involved, and that's got dangers. And the love poems of the Song of Songs bring these issues to the forefront. Yes, written in a culture and language and thought form of centuries ago, but it addresses the real issues. If you go back to Genesis, if you think of human beings simply as animals, the animals engage in sex because of instinct that drives them, because that's the only way to keep the species going. When God made humans, that's different. There is pleasure. There is commitment. It's at a different level. We don't live just by instinct. And what this book is stressing is there's a quality as well as intimacy. And that's a message that our societies need to learn across the world. Equality. But intimacy involves vulnerability. Nothing's hidden. Genesis describes God's ideal as that they were naked without shame. Intimacy involves vulnerability. But like everything else, that relationship has been damaged by our human rebellion against God. We think we can run our lives better. We know better than God. We go our own ways. And it affects relationships, including the sexual relationship. And in Jesus, there's healing of that relationship as there's healing of everything and anything. But it's not yet complete within us. Now it's true, but it's also true that the New Testament never quotes the Song of Songs, ever. And it never quotes it specifically in the context of God's relationship with humanity, undermining any sort of allegorical interpretation of the book. If you think about it for a moment, that has to be true. Exclusivity. God wants to be our God and to be the only God in our lives, because he knows that when we follow his way and make him God, then he can enable us to live the greatest and most fulfilled lives. But if it's not exclusive, we miss out. If it's not exclusive in a sexual relationship, we miss out. But again, the Song of Songs is never quoted in the New Testament to make that point. Now, with that overview in mind, we've got the background to this book. And the next presentations, we're going to be looking at some of the themes from the Song of Songs to see what the book can teach us about sexuality for today.